Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Lucan Hollis, and this is what the first month of the outbreak did to my world. I'm not a soldier. I was never a cop. I wasn't one of those doomsday preppers who waited for the sky to fall just so they could say they saw it coming. I was a fixer. I worked jobs that needed hands and calluses more than a resume, heating and air, framing engines, and I thought zombies were just a punchline for bad movies and late-night beer talk. But the news feeds went sideways fast. It started with grainy clips of brawls in subway stations and grocery store parking lots, shaky cell phone videos of people moving all wrong and refusing to stay down when they should have. The talking heads called it an incident, then a wave, then civil unrest. By the time they finally used the word containment, entire city blocks had already gone dark. I always assumed, like everyone else, that if the dead ever walked, they would be slow. We all pictured shufflers, arms out, easy to outrun as long as you didn't trip over your own feet. We were dead wrong. What we got was a nightmare on fast forward. These things are sprinters. They are pale bodies that hit a dead run in a heartbeat and don't stop. Their joints bend too far, their fingers tear through wood, and sometimes they drop to all fours and hunt like dogs that have forgotten how to be human. That's why I'm out here, hunkered down in an old stilt house hovering over a lake instead of hiding in some hallway back in the city. The dead own the dirt now. They chase anything with a pulse, and if you stand on solid ground for too long, sooner or later they find you. But out here, the water breaks their path. They hit the shoreline and the brakes lock up. They can scream, they can crowd the bank, but they won't cross. The house itself isn't a fortress. It's a leaning stack of old boards, rusty nails, and gaps that let the wind cut straight through to your bones. It used to be somebody's cheap weekend fishing shack. Now it's all I have, and if I want to stay breathing, I have to make it hold. The end didn't announce itself with a bang. It started as background noise. It was just chatter in the break room, something to stare at while the coffee brewed. We huddled around a phone screen watching a shaky clip of a brawl on a subway platform. Some guy on the ground took 3 heavy blows to the head, shots that should have put his lights out, and he just snapped back up like a spring. Later that night, the anchor called it an unusual drug reaction, and everyone made the same tired jokes about bath salts and synthetic trash hitting the streets. We laughed because it was easier than admitting the footage looked wrong. 2 days later, the laughter died. A new clip ran on repeat, filmed from a security camera in a parking garage. A man in torn clothes dropped to all fours and sprinted between parked cars with a speed that made my stomach turn. It wasn't human movement. It was fluid, predatory, and impossible. Security tried to corner him with 2 trucks, but he slipped through a gap that looked way too small, ignoring the metal scraping his skin, and went straight for the loudest voice he could hear. The station blurred the last few seconds and cut away to the studio. In the news crawl underneath, someone had typed, "Ongoing incident near research facility outside city limits, possible containment breach." The day it stopped being a distant news story and became my reality, I was stuck in gridlock on an overpass. 4 lanes of traffic were locked in place, bumper to bumper, vibrating with heat and exhaust. A delivery truck had me pinned on the left, and a minivan full of kids sat on my right. Horns echoed off the concrete walls in a useless, angry chorus. Then a new sound cut through the mechanical noise, sharp, high, and wrong enough that even the kids in the minivan went quiet and pressed their faces to the glass. 3 cars ahead, a man yanked another driver out of his open door in one violent motion. For a split second, it looked like standard road rage, just another fight in a city full of short fuses. Then the attacker moved, and that label fell apart. He didn't shove or swing a fist. He hit like a launched object, pale skin flashing, teeth bared. Both of them went to the ground, thrashing, and then only one stood up again. The injured driver never even raised his hands to defend himself. Engines revved as panic set in, but nobody had room to move. The thing, because it wasn't a man anymore, snapped its head toward the nearest running car. It hit the hood, grabbed the top of the windshield and pounded with bare fists until the safety glass started to cave in. When the driver tried to scramble into the back seat, the thing climbed closer and forced itself through the shattered opening with him. Whatever I had pictured when I joked about zombies over beers, it was not that. There was no slow shuffle, no wobble, no polite space to jog away. On flat ground, these things were sprinters that never ran out of breath. They ignored pain. They ignored broken glass slicing their palms and twisted joints snapping under stress. They chased noise and motion, and they did not stop until there was nothing left to chase. Far back in the line, someone finally did more than stare. A heavy sedan hit the car in front of it hard enough to shove the whole row forward. The impact shook my lane and opened a narrow, jagged gap between my bumper and the truck in front. I didn't sit there and weigh the pros and cons. I turned the wheel hard, climbed the shoulder, scraped the entire passenger side along the guardrail with a scream of tearing metal, and forced my way off that bridge while other drivers were still holding their phones up to record their own deaths. The city didn't fall all at once. It bled out. Transit alerts blew up my phone until the network jammed. Stores closed early, then didn't open at all, and pictures of stripped shelves showed up in every group chat. A local anchor finally said the words, "experimental treatment" and "facility breach," before the feed cut to a color bar that never went away. My boss locked up the shop and sent one last text that just said, "Stay safe," and then he stopped answering. At home, I barred my apartment door with a length of steel pipe I'd scavenged from a job site and slept in my clothes with my boots next to the bed. Sirens moved closer, screaming day and night, until they eventually faded into silence. I could hear single gunshots instead of distant muffled bursts, people making their last stands. Once in a while, something fast crossed the intersection outside, dragging a long, wet scream behind it until the sound stopped mid-breath. Part of me kept waiting for the National Guard to roll in with tanks and neat lines. They never did. One night, the power blinked, surged, and died. It never came back. The building went from a low mechanical hum to a heavy, suffocating silence in a few seconds. I filled the bathtub before the pressure died, but by morning the tap only coughed rust and air. That third night in the dark, something slammed into the ground floor door again and again like a battering ram. I sat on the first landing with my back against the wall, a shotgun across my knees, and counted each hit until the frame finally cracked and something pale crashed through into the lobby. It didn't come up the stairs. Someone on the first floor shouted once, a sharp, surprised sound that ended too quickly. And then nothing else moved. No steps on the concrete stairs. No more hits, no doors opening. I stayed on that landing in the dark until my legs shook from holding still and my hands ached from gripping the gun, listening to the silence of a building that had just become a tomb. Sleep was over after that. I went back inside, spread what I owned on the floor, and kept only what helped me move. Food from my cabinets and the stash from the neighbor who never came back. Clothes I could layer. A few tools that could pry, cut, or hammer. And the old Remington pump-action shotgun my uncle had left years ago, along with the box and a half of birdshot he'd forgotten. I knew the highways were out. I had seen what those things did to stalled cars and trapped people. They were just sardine cans waiting to be opened. The streets were long, open lanes built for speed, and speed now belonged to them. Concrete was their ground, but water? Water was not. Under all the fear, a clear picture surfaced from a summer job I'd done a few years back. I'd driven out to a remote lake to fix the rotted railing on an ugly, cheap stilt house people rented for fishing weekends. I remembered cursing the location because we couldn't get the truck close to the structure. That house stood on heavy legs above the water, a good 20 yards off the shore with nothing but open surface between it and the land. It was the only place in the world that made sense. Leaving the city wasn't courage. It was fear with a plan attached to it. The stairwell smelled like rot, a mix of garbage and sour panic rising from the lobby below. Nobody answered when I knocked on the few doors I passed, and the screaming outside had dropped to a heavy, terrifying silence. Staying meant waiting in a box until something fast broke the lock. I packed what I could carry in one trip: tools, food, warm layers, and checked the Remington pump action one last time. I cycled the action to make sure it fed smooth, then topped off the tube. I walked out of the apartment without looking back. Keys didn't matter anymore. I took the back stairs to avoid the elevator. The main lobby was a wreck, the security door hanging crooked like someone had driven a ram through it. Dark footprints led across the tile, but I didn't follow them. I cut through the service hall into the alley and froze. No horns, no shouting, just wind and a loose metal sign tapping against a pole. My truck was 3 blocks away behind a laundromat. Getting there was the first test. I stuck to the walls, treating every corner like a choke point, checking under parked cars for ankles. At the final intersection, a sedan sat with doors open and hazard lights blinking a slow, dying rhythm. A delivery van had smashed into a storefront. No people, no uniforms, just the city waiting. I crossed the street fast, shotgun low by my thigh. The laundromat was empty, clothes still hanging out of machines. My truck sat in the back lot, dented blue paint fading under the gray sky. Owning a beater nobody wanted finally paid off. I slid behind the wheel, pulled the door shut quietly, and prayed. The engine turned over on the second try, the sound deafening in the quiet lot. I watched the mirrors and counted to 5. Nothing came running. The fuel gauge sat just under half. That was all the range I had. The lake was an hour away. Interstates were off the table. I'd seen what those things did to stalled traffic. I stuck to side streets, rolling through dead red lights and dodging rush hour routes. The buildings thinned from apartment blocks to single-family houses, then to low strips of dark stores. The quiet felt strange. No music, no kids, just the drone of my engine. The suspension squeaked over potholes that city crews would never fill again. I kept the RPMs low, trying to be a ghost in a machine that was built to be loud. At one cross street, I finally saw one of them in full daylight. It stood barefoot in the middle of the lane, skin chalk white, jeans soaked in blood. Its head snapped toward my truck the instant I appeared. I saw the moment it decided I was food. There was no slow shuffle. Its muscles tightened, its jaw unhinged in a snarl, and it ran straight at me in a dead sprint. The sound of its bare feet slapping the asphalt was louder than my tires. I didn't wait. I yanked the wheel and turned into a side street. In the mirror, I saw it hit the corner too fast, stumble and scramble back up without slowing down. I floored it, cutting through a gas station and bouncing over a curb until houses blocked my view. When the mirror was clear, my hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel. That was the proof. On flat ground, you were just prey. The lake was the only place where the front door sat over water. Past the suburbs, the road ran between empty fields. Abandoned cars sat on the shoulders, doors open. I didn't stop. Clouds thickened, turning the sky the color of a bruise, and light snow began to fall. I shut off the static on the radio and just drove. When the old green sign for the lake road appeared, half hidden by branches, I took the turn. The lake road was a narrow strip of cracked asphalt with pines tight on both sides. Branches scraped the roof. I slowed down. Backing up here would be a nightmare. The air smelled colder, damp with pine resin. Around a bend, a massive fallen pine blocked both lanes. A small car had tried to squeeze past and failed, hanging high centered on the trunk. This was the end of the line for the truck. I killed the engine, and the silence rushed back in. I grabbed the shotgun and my tool bag. I climbed over the stranded car, pausing to smash its window and grab a wool blanket and a bottle of water from the back seat. Scavenging was habit now. I slid down the far side of the tree trunk. A narrow gravel access lane branched off, winding downhill into the dark woods. The lane ended at a dirt lot with a ruined picnic table. Beyond the trees, the lake sat flat and gray. The water looked dark and heavy, deep enough to hold heat and resist freezing. That water was my wall. A few yards offshore, the Stilt house stood on its legs, dark boards against the gray sky. The wooden walkway was broken in the middle, leaving a 10-foot gap. Perfect. Nobody had walked to that door in a long time. I checked the shore. Nothing moved. I walked the mud bank and found what I needed near the far corner, a small aluminum rowboat upside down in the weeds. I flipped it over, the metal booming like a gong in the quiet. I froze, waiting for a reaction from the woods. Nothing. I dragged the boat to the water. I checked the oarlocks before I shoved off. They were dry and rusted, guaranteed to screech. I dipped them in the lake water to lubricate the metal before I slotted the oars in. Quiet mattered more than rust now. I shoved off and rowed. The cold soaked my boots, but the bottom dropped away fast. I kept my eyes on the trees. Up close, the stilts looked thick and solid. The broken walkway ended in empty air, meaning nothing could sprint to the door. I tied the boat to a piling, climbed the makeshift ladder to the deck, and tried the door. Unlocked. The wind cut through the gaps in the siding, reminding me that this wasn't a fortress, just a shelter. But it was over water. I stepped inside into the dark and closed the door on the world I'd left behind. Inside the stilt house, I walked from one end to the other, listening to the boards groan under my boots, and forced myself to admit the truth. This place was only safer, not safe. Safety was a memory. What I had was isolation. The front door had a loose jamb that rattled in the wind, and a cheap deadbolt meant for weekend fights over beer, not for keeping out fast things that hit with the force of a truck. If one of those pale sprinters ever figured out how to reach the deck, it would blow through this place like wet cardboard unless I changed the basics. The first fix was the umbilical cord connecting me to the land, the old walkway. Rot had already eaten the middle section, leaving a gap, but solid boards still clung to the stringers near the posts on both sides. It was too inviting. As long as timber reached out toward the shore, it felt like a bridge waiting to be crossed. I went outside with my pry bar and a hammer. I didn't just kick the wood away, I salvaged it. Wood was fuel and armor now. I pried up every plank I could reach, pulling rusty nails with a screech that echoed too loudly over the water, and dragged them onto the deck. Once the useful timber was stacked, I kicked at the rotted stringers until the last stub snapped off and fell into the lake. When I was done, the surgery was complete. There was nothing between the porch and the bank except 20 yards of open, dark water. Nobody could reach the house without a boat or a swim, and so far the dead stayed on land. Next came the structure itself. I spent an hour underneath the house in the rowboat, checking the legs. Heavy creosote-treated posts ran down into the lake bed with diagonal cross-bracing bolted between them. Some of the cross pieces were soft at the ends, spongy with years of water damage, but the main pilings felt like iron. Nothing shifted when I leaned my weight into it. As long as those main posts held, nothing could sprint up at us from below. Inside, the front door was the weak point, the fatal funnel, as the tactical guys on TV used to call it. I pulled 2 interior doors off their hinges, hollow core, cheap stuff but better than air, and stood them behind the main entrance like shields. I dragged a heavy oak dresser from the bedroom, the drawers filled with old bedding to add weight, and jammed it tight against the handle. It became my new deadbolt. I cut short scraps of salvaged lumber into triangular wedges and hammered them into the gaps at the bottom and top of the door frame. The door could still open if I spent 5 minutes dismantling the barricade, but nobody outside was going to kick once and walk in. I needed daylight and a way to watch the shore, but I didn't need a row of glass at chest height that offered zero protection. I cut the salvaged walkway planks into rough panels, screwed simple hinges along one edge, and mounted each panel above a window. During the day, I could tie them up with a length of rope to let light in. At night, I dropped them and braced the bottom with a crossbar. Now, if claws, tools, or stray bullets came our way, they met 2 inches of weathered pine before they touched glass. Heat was the next survival tier. A small cast-iron potbelly stove waited in one corner, tilted on a crooked leg covered in more rust than paint. I dragged it away from the wall to inspect it. I brushed layers of dust off the stovepipe and checked each joint all the way up to the roof for cracks. Carbon monoxide would kill me just as dead as a zombie, and it would do it while I slept. I didn't see any gaps, but I wasn't taking chances. I stacked scavenged bricks and broken floor tiles behind the unit as a heat shield so the dry wall wouldn't scorch or catch fire. The deck shed held a short stack of dry split logs, maybe a quarter cord. It was just enough to make me hopeful and anxious at the same time. I carried the wood inside, set it by the stove, and did the math. Burning hot and high would empty that pile in 4 days. Small, steady fires could stretch it into weeks. I chose small. I needed enough heat to keep my fingers working and stop the pipes in my own chest from freezing. Not enough to turn the house into a beacon. A test burn with thin scraps proved the concept. The smoke pulled up the draft efficiently, and outside, the thin gray column dispersed into the low clouds instead of hanging over the roof like a signal flag. With heat handled, I spread my food inventory on the kitchen counter. Canned soup, beans, mixed vegetables, rice, oats, a jar of peanut butter, and a few tins of Spam. It was a pathetic little line of labels standing between me and starvation. Alone and careful, rationing down to the calorie, I might stretch it for 3 weeks. If I had to share, it would vanish in days. That reality turned the lake from a defensive bonus into my primary grocery store. On the lower deck, I found 2 old fiberglass fishing rods in a cracked plastic tackle box. The hooks were rusty at the shoulders, but still sharp at the tips. The monofilament line looked tired and brittle, so I stripped the first 10 yards and tied fresh knots, testing them until they cut into my hand. For bait, I used balls of stale bread and small strips of jerky, and later gristle from the canned meat. I dropped a line near a piling, looped it over my index finger, and waited to feel the twitch of life. The first fish was a bluegill, barely the size of my hand, but it was fresh protein that hadn't come out of a factory tin. I cleaned it over a bucket, tossed the guts far out from the stilts to avoid drawing flies, and cooked the fillets in a pan on the stove. I used just enough wood to turn the flesh opaque. With that one meal, the numbers in my head shifted. As long as the lake had fish and I didn't get stupid, hunger wouldn't be the thing that finished me. Water was the other half of the equation. It came from the lake and from whatever the sky gave up. I tied a clean bucket to a rope, lowered it from the side deck, and pulled it up slow so it didn't clang against the posts. Inside, I poured that raw water through a jerry-rigged filter I built from a cut plastic milk jug. I layered gravel, sand, folded cloth from a t-shirt, and a small carbon cartridge I found in a kitchen drawer. It didn't make the water safe. Viruses didn't care about sand, but it took the worst of the grit, algae, and color out. Every batch still went onto the stove until it hit a rolling boil for a full minute before I poured it into saved bottles. Rain and snow made the job easier. When the first steady rain moved over the lake, I set clean tubs and pots under the roof's drip edge. Later, when heavy, wet flakes started to stick to the deck instead of melting on contact, I scraped clean snow into pans and set them near the stove to melt. It cost time and precious wood, but every gallon I pulled from the sky was one less trip with the bucket, and one less roll of the dice with lake parasites. Hygiene had to stay simple, strict, and logical. Dysentery in a place like this was a death sentence. A plastic 5-gallon bucket with a snap-on lid and heavy-duty contractor bags became the toilet. I didn't just dump it anywhere. I threw a wood chip into the water and watched the drift for an hour to figure out the current. Once I knew the flow moved south, away from the house, I designated the southwest corner of the deck as the disposal point. I sealed each bag and dumped the contents well away from where I drew drinking water. A bar of soap and a small bottle of hand sanitizer lived by the sink, guarded like gold. I used them religiously after handling fish, waste, or anything from shore. Infection didn't care how strong my walls were or how fast I could row. By the end of those first few days on the stilts, the place still looked worn, cheap, and fragile, but it finally functioned like a survival system. The dead owned the ground, but the water kept them off my steps, and that was enough reason to stay busy and keep breathing. The third evening on the lake gave me more than wind and small waves. I was checking a fishing line on the side deck when a single gunshot rolled over the water from the trees. It was sharp and flat in the cold air, and a second later a dog barked, deep and steady. I grabbed the binoculars, dropped to a knee on the front deck, and scanned the near shore. Bare trunks, scrub, pale dirt, nothing. Then a man burst from the tree line at a full run with a rifle on a sling and a German shepherd on a leash beside him while the dog barked in short, furious bursts. 3 pale bodies came out of the trees behind them and hit a full sprint in the same breath. Even at that distance, I could see how clean and wrong their movement was. Joints snapping straight, bare feet digging for ground with no sign of pain or fatigue. They were not coming toward the house. They followed the curve of the bank, locked to the line where dirt met water, and in less than a minute the trees would hide them. I could sit on my deck and let distance and luck decide how that ended, then tell myself it had never really been my problem. Or I could risk the only boat I had for a stranger and his dog who were already almost out of time. Fear said stay put. The part of me that had just spent days turning a rotten weekend cabin into something that might hold said move. I set the binoculars down, grabbed the shotgun and the oar, and went down the ladder to the small rowboat tied under the deck. The hull bumped the posts as I climbed in. I untied the line, pushed off, and watched the stilts slide away until the house turned into a dark shape over the water. Every scrape of the oar felt too loud, but nothing new moved on the shore except the chase. I rowed at an angle toward where the runner would hit the edge, not straight in. Too close to land, and one bad stroke would leave me stuck in the mud with no time to fix it. Too far out, and I would just watch him go down. The dog saw me first, barked once in a different tone, and the man glanced over. He saw the boat and leaned his run a little toward me without slowing. By the time I reached the depth where the hull scraped bottom, the dead were only a few seconds behind him. I dug the oar once more, let the boat coast, and brought the shotgun up. The bead settled on the chest of the lead sprinter as the bow rose and fell on the small chop. I waited for a flat breath and pulled the trigger. The front runner folded mid-stride and slammed into the dirt. The others split around the body and barely slowed. I racked the slide, aimed lower at the second one, and fired again. This time, the shot tore into its legs and turned its run into a drag while the third kept coming. "That's all I've got range for," I muttered to myself. Then I raised my voice and shouted over the water. "When I say now, you go straight in with the dog first, and then you follow right behind him without stopping." He nodded once while he ran and answered, "Understood, I'm ready when you are," without looking away from the strip where the bank dropped into the lake. Up close, the slope fell fast into deeper water. I rowed in until the hull kissed solid ground and stopped, because any closer and I risked pinning us when I needed to move. "Now!" I yelled. The shepherd hit the water first with a heavy splash, legs kicking as the bottom disappeared under him. The man shoved the rifle behind his shoulder on the sling, kept one hand on the leash, and jumped with both feet. Cold spray hit my face as they closed the last few yards. Behind them, the nearest of the dead reached the place where dirt turned to water and stopped. It paced, crouched, and lunged, but its feet stayed planted in the wet ground. The crawler with ruined legs dragged itself to the edge and pawed at the line, but did not set a foot into the lake. They wanted the shore, not the water, and for now that one limit was the only reason this had not already killed all 3 of us. The dog reached the hull, claws slipping on wet wood as he tried to pull himself in. The boat listed dangerously to the right. I dropped the shotgun to the boards, grabbed the harness at the back of his neck, and hauled him into the boat. He landed in a heap, shook once, then planted himself between me and the man still in the water, lips back from his teeth but eyes steady. "Easy," I said, keeping my hands low while I leaned toward the man and offered my wrist. "The boat is the only way out now, so grab my arm and pull yourself up." He caught my arm with a strong, controlled grip, and I dragged him over the gunwale. The boat rocked hard, taking on water, then settled. I snatched up the oar and shoved us backward, putting a stretch of dark water between us and the thin strip of shore where pale bodies still paced with nowhere to go. "You always row straight at trouble like that?" he asked after a few breaths, rolling to one side and pushing himself up on an elbow while water ran off his jacket into the gaps between the boards. "Not if I can help it," I said, keeping my eyes on the tree line and the empty water between us and the bank. "You got a name?" "Lowell Grady," he answered, resting a hand on the dog's neck. "And this is Rook. We ran out of road back there and you were the only thing out here that looked like a chance. I nodded once and said, "The gamble isn't finished yet. I need to know if you have any bites or deep scratches or blood on you that isn't yours." He pushed his sleeves back and turned his hands palm up so I could see. "No bites," he answered. "Just scratches from the branches and a knee that was bad before this started. If I thought I might flip on you, I would have stayed on the shore and saved you the risk." We hauled Lowell and Rook up through the hatch into the main room, and for a long moment the three of us just stood there and let the heat from the small stove touch our faces. Rook paced once in a slow circle, sniffing each wall and table leg to map the space, then settled near the stove with his back to the corner so he could watch both the door and the ladder. Lowell watched him for a second, then looked at me and said, "If he didn't like the smell of this place, we'd be back in the boat already." I moved one of the interior doors so it leaned across the main entrance, set the dresser back against it to jam the handle, and nodded toward the small table. "Sit for a bit and thaw out," I told him. "We can talk about the house rules once you get your breath back." He unbuckled the rifle sling, set the gun where we could both see it, and dropped into the chair with a long exhale that sounded like it had been stuck in his chest since the highway. We started simple because simple was all that mattered anymore. I pointed at the stove, the wood stack, and the line of cans on the counter. "Heat, food, and water are the whole game now," I said. "We keep the fire low so nobody sees us from shore. We eat what we catch before we touch the cans, and we only step on dirt when there is no other option." Lowell rubbed his hands over the stove door, watched the small flames, and nodded. "Fine by me," he said. "The road is done anyway. Water and wood are what's left." He opened his pack without being asked and laid out what he had on the floor between us. A half bag of rice, a few dented cans, a roll of trash bags, 2 cheap tarps, a small metal pot, and the pack of dog treats that Rook watched like it was gold. I added his food to my shelf, put the tarps on top of the storage chest, and kept the bags handy for waste. "Everything we own is on these boards now," I said while I stacked the cans. "So nothing disappears without one of us knowing where it went." He nodded once at that and didn't argue. The days that followed settled into a rhythm because the alternative was panic or boredom, and neither helped us stay alive. Morning started before the first good light reached the far bank. One of us checked the lines from the side deck, working by feel more than sight, while the other stayed inside with the shotgun near the door and the dog close enough to hear every creak. Some dawns the hooks came up empty and we ate thin portions from a can. Other mornings silver fish twisted on the lines and we cleaned them over a bucket and cooked them in the small pan with just enough heat to make the flesh opaque. Lowell proved steady instead of reckless. On the second day, he took one of the torn nets from the deck shed, sat cross-legged on the floor and mended holes with slow, neat knots. When I asked where he had learned to do that, he told me he spent years pulling stuck cars and boats out of places they shouldn't have been. He tightened one more knot and added, "You pick up a few tricks when chains and ropes are the only things between you and a bad day." Rook claimed his own job without any talk from us. The dog walked slow circuits of the deck when we worked outside, nose up, ears shifting with every sound from the woods. If his head snapped toward the trees and stayed there, we stopped what we were doing and listened until the quiet felt honest again. The cold came in stages. First it was just a sharper edge on the wind and a thin skin of ice around the posts at dawn. Then snow dusted the roof and stuck in the corners of the deck where the sun never quite reached. We stuffed rags and torn cloth into every visible gap, and Lowell helped me hang one of his tarps over the worst stretch of wall. He pressed the tape flat along the edges so it wouldn't flap in the wind. "Not pretty," he said, stepping back to look at the work. "But pretty is dead now." Even with all that, the house never felt warm, only less cold. We burned the smallest fire that would keep our fingers working. At night, we moved our bedrolls closer to the stove and slept in layers, boots lined up where we could grab them in the dark. I watched the woodpile shrink one small armload at a time and knew we would have to touch shore again before long if we wanted any kind of flame. We talked through those trips the same way we talked through everything else, slow and in detail. On the first run for wood, I stayed in the boat with the oar ready and the shotgun across my knees while Lowell stepped onto a narrow strip of bank with a handsaw and a coil of rope. Rook lay on the deck above us with his head over the rail, watching every move. Lowell cut only dead limbs that already lay close to the water, dragged them in short bursts, and never let his back stay turned to the trees for more than a few seconds. When Rook gave a low growl that didn't sound like boredom, Lowell dropped the branch he was dragging and walked straight back to the boat without waiting to finish the cut. We worked like that in short runs until the stack by the stove looked less like a joke, and each time we pushed off from shore, I felt some part of my chest unclench. I told myself that the next trip could still be the one where something pale broke from the trees and erased how careful we thought we were. At night, we kept the lantern low and played cards so our hands had something to do while the wind pushed at the walls. Every so often, he would tap the toe of his boot against the floor. "They still haven't touched the water," he said one night, staring at his cards. "Not once." I nodded and answered, "That's the one rule we can count on until it changes." Then we would both glance at the dark glass and the faint band of snow along the shore and leave the rest of that thought alone. Rook noticed her first. He lifted his massive head from his spot by the stove, stared past me toward the open water, and gave a low, vibrating woof that was not his usual answer to the woods. It was a warning. I stepped onto the front deck, followed his gaze into the gray afternoon, and saw a small, dark shape moving across the lake, cutting hard against the wind instead of drifting with it. I went inside for the binoculars, came back out, and focused until the blur turned into a narrow canoe with a single person paddling. Lowell stepped through the door behind me and asked what I had. I handed him the binoculars and said it was a single paddler heading straight for us. He watched for a long moment, then lowered the glass and remarked that if they made it this far on the water, they either got lucky or they knew exactly what they were doing. We watched the boat work its way closer until we could see her without the glass. A short rifle hung on a sling across her chest, muzzle down, and both hands stayed locked on the paddle in a tired rhythm. I stepped to the side window, slid it open just enough for my voice to carry, and shouted that was close enough for now and told her to stop there and hold. She flinched at the sound, dug the paddle in to steady herself against the chop, and answered in a clear, tired voice that she was stopped. She asked me to just talk to her before I decided she was a problem. Her boat drifted a little while she adjusted, but she never reached for the rifle. I kept one hand on the sill and the other near the shotgun by the door and asked her name and how long she had been out there. She rested the paddle across her knees and said her name was Elodie Vance. She told us she had cut off the highway 2 days ago, followed a river down through the slush, and had been working this shoreline since then, trying to decide if the house was empty or if someone lived in it. That could have been a rehearsed line, so I asked how many people were with her. She shook her head once and said she was alone now. She explained that they were 3 when they left the city, but one turned fast and the other grabbed their only decent car and drove off while she was looking for a map. She added that if anyone was behind her now, it wasn't because they were tracking her on purpose. The lake around her stayed flat and open, and no second boat followed. It could still have been a trap. So I asked the big question. How long since she was bitten, scratched, or covered in anyone else's blood? She answered without pausing and said there were no bites, no scratches, and no blood that wasn't hers. She told me that if she thought she might flip, she wouldn't paddle toward one of the only dry spots on this lake because that would be suicide for both of us. Lowell stood just behind my shoulder where she could see him, and he said in a voice meant for me that she knew to come by water and didn't panic when she saw us. I nodded once and kept my eyes on her. I shouted back that if I let her tie up under the house and she was wrong about any of that, we were done, and there was no backup plan after that. She did not argue. She shifted her weight to keep the boat steady and said I could let her come closer and check her as hard as I needed to. She told me that if I didn't like what I found, I could send her back out and she wouldn't fight me, but if I sent her away now, the cold would just do the same job a little slower. We let that hang for a few breaths while the boat rocked in the light chop. I finally told her all right. I instructed her to paddle under the front deck and tie off to the center post, but to keep her hands where we could see them when she was close. She answered with a short "understood" and started a slow, careful stroke that brought her along the side of the house and out of sight under the boards. We met her at the hatch in the main floor. I opened it, looked straight down, and saw her standing in the small boat with one hand on the post and the other on a fresh knot. She glanced up into the warmer air and asked if I wanted to handle this up there or down here. I decided dragging it out in the cold would not help anyone think clearly, so I pointed at the ladder and told her to climb with both hands, nice and slow, and to leave the rifle in the boat. She nodded, unhooked the sling, set the rifle carefully on the seat, and then climbed until her head cleared the floor. Lowell waited at my side with his gun lowered but ready, and I kept mine resting on my leg. Once she was standing in the room, I stepped back just far enough to give her space and looked her over. She was thinner than her jacket suggested, lips cracked from wind and cold, but her eyes stayed clear and steady. She raised both hands a little and said I could check her arms or neck or whatever I needed because she would rather get that part over with. I moved closer, kept my steps slow so Rook would not read it as a threat, and checked her wrists, forearms, and neck for anything that looked like a bite or a deep, fresh scratch. Her skin showed old bruises and a few lines from branches and rope, but nothing that matched what the fast ones left behind. I stepped back and told her that for now she was a guest, not a problem. I asked if she brought anything else useful besides the rifle in the boat. She let her hands fall, slid the pack off her shoulders, and set it on the floor. She said she had maps, a few tools, a box of screws, and a notebook full of measurements for houses on stilts. She explained that she used to be a structural inspector and did this for a living. She told us that when she saw our place from the far bank, she recognized the type immediately and could see the bracing was stressed. We had done what we could with scrap wood and guesswork, but having someone who understood how these legs held us up was more than I had expected the lake to give us. I looked at the notebook, then at the shaking walls, and realized she wasn't just a refugee. She was the reason we might not fall into the water when the next storm hit. The first real test of our reinforcements hit about a week after Elodie joined us. The lake had been flat and deceptively dull all morning, looking like a sheet of gray slate under a heavy, bruising sky. But around noon, the wind shifted direction in a way I could feel vibrating through the floorboards. It dropped the temperature 10 degrees in an hour. By late afternoon, the far bank was just a smear of white blur. Snow was coming in sideways like buckshot, and the surface of the water between us and the shore turned into broken white streaks where it was hard to tell the difference between churning waves and freezing slush. Elodie stood at the front window with her notebook open, one hand pressed against the glass to feel the vibration, watching the stilts flex with each hammer blow of the gust. She tapped the page with her pencil, frowned, and said that this place was built for weekend fishing trips in July, not for taking this kind of beating in a winter gale. She explained that if the wrong crossbrace gave way on the windward side, the torque would twist the entire deck until the main pilings snapped. Lowell grabbed a handful of shims, pushed another wedge under the rattling front door, tested it with the toe of his boot, and said, "You tell us exactly where it wants to break, and we will go out there and fix it before the wind does the work for us." We went out in short, brutal runs to limit the exposure. Lowell and I took the first pass with cut boards and a pocket full of galvanized screws that Elodie had hoarded for the worst spots. Rook stayed inside with her, his claws ticking nervously on the floor as he paced between the windows, whining every time the wind howled. Outside, the cold was a physical weight. Each time a gust hit, the wet posts hummed under my hand like a plucked guitar string. But they didn't slide in the lake bed. We worked fast, shouting over the wind, setting new diagonal braces between the main legs to lock the frame together tighter. We ducked back inside with snow packed into our hair and sleeves, fingers so stiff we could barely work the latch. Sometime past midnight, the wind turned and drove straight at the front door. Drafts we hadn't found yet cut through the room like knives, and the temperature dropped enough that our breath fogged even standing right next to the stove. I was reaching for another strip of cloth to jam into a crack when Rook's head snapped toward the window. His ears went stiff and the fur along his spine stood up. He gave a low, rumbling growl that stayed deep in his chest and didn't fade. I moved to the glass, wiped away the heavy condensation with my sleeve, and looked toward the shore. The trees were only dark smears behind a moving wall of white, but something was moving low along the edge of the lake. It wasn't the wind. Lowell joined me at the window, squinting into the blur. "Tell me that is just branches blowing around," he said, though his tone said he knew better. It wasn't branches. A thinner gust tore a temporary gap in the falling snow, and in that second of clarity I saw them. Pale shapes were running along the bank, cutting through the drifts like they barely felt the cold. They moved the way they always did on dry ground. Full sprint, heads forward, no stagger, and no sign of slowing down. There were more than I wanted to count, a ragged line of them strung along the boundary where the dirt stopped and the deep water began. "They're hugging the shoreline," I said, keeping my voice low out of habit, even though the storm drowned us out. The storm must have pushed them out of the woods. Something else flushed them out of whatever holes they were hiding in. Elodie stepped up between us, pulling her jacket tighter around her neck. She looked at the massive movement and said that anything loose on land would be looking for new shelter in a storm like this. She pointed out that from their side, our house probably looked like the only solid thing still standing in the void. The first of them reached the point on the bank closest to our stilts. It stopped abruptly, as if it had hit an electric fence we couldn't see. It paced back and forth, turned, and ran short, frantic bursts along the drop-off, never letting its bare feet leave the solid ground. Behind it, more bodies poured in from the tree line, some running on two legs, others dropping to all fours when the deep snow dragged at them. They spread along the bank in both directions until the shore was just a strip of violent motion under a sheet of white. One of them, a massive figure with torn clothes, stepped onto the ice that had formed in the shallows. The slush held him for a second, then gave way. His leg punched through into the black water below. He shrieked, a sound that cut right through the wind, and scrambled backward onto the dirt, thrashing until he was on solid ground again. Lowell watched through the binoculars, tracking the movement. He finally let the strap fall against his chest and said, "If they ever figure out that the ice might hold them further out, or that water doesn't bite, we are finished." I shook my head, watching the creature that had fallen in shake its frozen leg. "They haven't figured it out yet," I said. They stepped into the slush and panicked. The deep water is still open. Until that freezes solid, the lake is our only wall. For a long stretch of the night, nothing changed. The dead ran short loops up and down the edge, stopped, sniffed the air, and stared across the 20 yards of water toward the house. Some clawed at the frozen stones as if trying to drag themselves closer without losing ground, then gave up, loped back toward the trees, and circled to the same invisible line again. The storm wrapped them in snow and howling wind, but they kept moving like the cold meant absolutely nothing to their biology. Inside, the house groaned under the assault. We checked the braces again whenever a heavy gust hit, keeping our hands on the wood and feeling for any fresh give or vibration. Elodie tapped her pencil against her drawing and said, "If something goes, it will be the boards and railings up here on the deck, not the legs." "I can live with that. We can nail boards back on, but we can't replace a piling in this weather." It wasn't much comfort, but it beat picturing the whole frame dropping into the freezing lake. The night slid by in jagged pieces after that. We took turns dozing in short stretches near the stove while the others watched the bank. Every time I woke up and checked the window, the shapes were still there, restless lines pressed against the border they refused to cross. It felt like the storm had driven them to the edge of the world and dared them to find a way through, and they had all failed the test so far. Near dawn, the wind finally eased. The snow kept falling in heavy flakes, but the sharp, dangerous push against the walls turned into a steady background brush. One by one, the figures along the shoreline turned away from the water and vanished back into the trees. In less than an hour, the bank went from crowded to empty, leaving just a thin, pale strip between the dark trunks and the darker lake. We stepped out onto the deck together once the noise dropped to a level that felt safe. The air bit at the exposed skin around our eyes, and snow had piled up in uneven drifts against the railings. The deck boards had picked up a small tilt in spots, enough to feel under our boots. One section of railing hung loose where a bracket had torn free and shingles had come off the roof, leaving dark gaps we could see from the front corner. Elodie walked to the edge, braced one hand on a post, and leaned over the rail to study the legs in the gray light. She stayed like that for a long moment, watching the water swirl around the timber, then straightened up and said, "The stilts held. We lost some dressings, but no bones. We can fix dressings." Lowell thumped his boot lightly against the nearest brace, watched it stay firm, and said, "Then we keep patching it until it looks ugly and stays up." The pretty houses were the first ones to fall anyway. The storm and the dead had both tried to push us back to ground we couldn't stand on anymore. The boards creaked under our weight, the air cut through all our layers, and the shore still hid fast, tireless bodies that were waiting for the water to freeze. But the stilts were still in the lake, and the house was still ours to repair. And for one more day, that was enough. A few days after the storm finally broke, the trouble we had been expecting from the living finally reached the lake. It announced itself with a metallic clank, something heavy hitting rock, and a man's shout that cut across the water in a way the wind never did. It was the sound of confidence, and out here, confidence usually meant weapons. I stepped onto the front deck with the binoculars, keeping low behind the railing, and checked the bank where I had first pulled Lowell and Rook out of the water. 4 figures stood there now in almost the same spot, bundled in expensive winter gear with heavy packs and rifles slung across their chests. A bright orange plastic sled sat on the snow behind them, piled high with bags and secured with bungee cords. Lowell joined me at the rail, took the glass, and watched them for a few silent seconds before he lowered it. He noted quietly that they weren't half-frozen or empty-handed, and from the way they moved, they had been eating well. Elodie stood just inside the darkened doorway, keeping out of sight, and said that if they made it this far, they already knew someone was living on the water because we couldn't pretend to be a ruin with smoke coming out of the chimney. The man who had been pointing at the house cupped his gloved hands around his mouth and shouted something we couldn't quite hear over the breeze. I slid the side window panel open just enough for my voice to carry without exposing my whole head and shouted for them to stay on the bank because that was far enough. The leader didn't seem fazed. He walked right up to the edge until his boots crunched on the frozen strip of mud and waved his arm like we were neighbors meeting at a barbecue. He shouted back that we should relax because they weren't sick and they weren't here to rush us. He yelled that we had a house and heat, and they had wheels and supplies, so I should bring the boat over and we could talk like adults. His tone was slick, the kind of voice that was used to deals going his way because he had the biggest stick. I let Rook press against my leg, feeling the rumble in his chest, and kept my voice flat and hard. I told him that this place held 3 people and a dog, and that was the absolute limit. I reminded him that the dead owned everything behind him, and I wasn't risking the boat or the integrity of the stilts just so he could stand in my doorway and count my food. He paused for a beat, looking at the house like he was calculating the odds, then turned to the others and said something that made one of them give a short, sharp laugh. A moment later, one of his people raised a rifle and looked our way through a mounted scope. Lowell stepped back from the glass instantly and said that if they thought they could lean on us from there, they would keep pressing until something broke. Elodie kept her eyes on the tree line behind them and warned that every shot they fired would tell the wrong things exactly where to run. The first round hit the wall near my head a second later. It punched through the old boards with a sharp, dry crack, sending a spray of splinters jumping into the room and sliding across the floor by Elodie's boots. Rook barked once, a sharp sound of surprise, then dropped low by the stove on his own instinct. I pulled the wooden panel down until only a narrow firing slot stayed open and said that they had started this, and if we let it slide now, They would be walking through our door by sunset. Lowell had already taken a position at the other window where he had a clear line of sight along the bank. He settled his rifle on the sill, breathing slow, and said, "We pick our shots carefully, drop the threat, and then stop to let the lake finish the argument." Outside, the man who had called us neighbors stood half-turned, talking to his group and pointing at the boat tied under our deck. When he faced us again, I didn't hesitate. I set the shotgun sight on the middle of his chest, right over the zipper of his parka, exhaled half a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The shot kicked my shoulder hard, the boom echoing like thunder over the water. The slug hit him center mass, and he dropped straight down into the snow like his strings had been cut. The others froze for a heartbeat, stunned that the conversation had turned into a body count so fast. Then the one with the scope snapped his gun up and fired blindly. A new hole appeared in the frame inches above my slot, showering me with dust. Lowell answered immediately with a single disciplined round from his side. The scoped rifle spun out of its owner's hands as he staggered back, clutching a shattered shoulder. Rook gave the first sign that the noise had reached something else. He left his spot by the stove, padded quickly to the far window, and stared down the shoreline with his ears flattened against his skull. A few seconds later, a broken, gurgling scream rose from the trees, the kind of sound we had learned meant a chase had started. Another scream answered it, then another, until the noise under the fading echoes of gunfire turned into a rough, hungry chorus. Elodie shifted to a narrow opening in the wall and looked toward the woods. After one careful breath, she said they were coming out of the trees and they were all heading for the shooting. She told us to stop firing because we needed to stop giving them directions. I eased my finger off the trigger and Lowell did the same. The men on the bank had made themselves the brightest, loudest point on this side of the lake, and the bill was coming due. From the cover of the darkened house, we watched the first of the pale bodies break out of the tree line at a full sprint. Its arms pumped furiously, head low, running with that terrifying, impossible energy. It didn't slow down when it saw the sled and the people behind it. It just shifted its path and ran straight at the closest shape that had a pulse. The men reacted on reflex and fired back, panic taking over their aim, their rounds hitting torsos that didn't feel pain and faces that didn't change expression. More of the fast ones poured out after the leader, a wave of gray skin and tearing hands. Some stayed on 2 legs while others dropped to 4 when the rough ground dragged at them. They spread along the bank and shut off any path that didn't involve the lake, and the men had already chosen to keep the freezing water at their backs. The first runner hit the man nearest the sled with the force of a linebacker and drove him down hard into the snow. After that, the shore became a single moving knot of violence where it was hard to tell which limb belonged to which body. The gunshots faded, then stopped entirely. What carried across the ice after that were wet snarls and the scrape of bare feet on frozen dirt. One of the dead broke from the feeding knot and ran along the bank all the way to the point closest to our stilts, stopping with its toes right at the slushy water's edge. It stood there, chest heaving, with its eyes fixed on the house long enough that my hands started to sweat on the shotgun stock. It paced the line, testing the slush, but the deep water held it back. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, it turned away like all the others had before and ran back toward the tree line to rejoin the pack. We stayed off the deck and away from the glass for a long time, waiting until the last of the pale shapes drifted back into the woods. When the shoreline finally emptied, the place where the 4 men had stood was just a churned strip of red snow and dark stains that slid slowly toward the lake. The sled was still there, overturned but intact. No one suggested rowing over that day. We knew the rifles, the ammunition, and whatever food sat in those bags were valuable, maybe even enough to get us through the rest of winter. But we also knew the woods were listening. For the moment, the only thing that mattered was that we were still above the water on solid posts, and that the fast ones had once again refused to leave dry ground. Anyone who found this shore next would see the marks in the snow and the empty casings, and they might think twice before shouting up at the house and lighting the same fuse. We would get the gear eventually, but we weren't stupid enough to ring the dinner bell twice in one day. By the time the 30th day rolled around, the house no longer felt like a borrowed weekend cabin or a temporary hiding spot. It felt like a machine we had taken apart and put back together with our own hands, one small, desperate fix at a time. The floorboards still creaked under our weight. The walls still leaked cold drafts around the edges, and nothing about the place looked clean. But every piece of wood and scrap metal now had a specific reason to be there. We had poured enough sweat equity into this structure that it finally felt like ours. Most mornings started the exact same way, a routine etched into us by survival. Whoever woke first checked Rook, because the dog knew about trouble long before our human ears could pick it up. If his ears were relaxed and his eyes were half closed, dozing in the warmth of the stove, we let ourselves breathe a little easier and start the coffee water. But if his head came up and he stared toward the shore with that rigid, intense focus, we moved slower, kept our voices to a whisper, and kept our hands closer to the loaded guns by the door. Once the dog gave the all clear, someone checked the fishing lines and the nets on the lower deck while the others fed the stove, cleared a path through the overnight snow, and scraped the ice away from the ladder and the hatch so they wouldn't freeze shut. Fish had become the absolute base of every meal, the fuel that kept us going. Some days the lake was generous and gave us more than we needed, so we cooked the extra fillets and stored them in a covered pan in the coolest corner of the room for later. Other days the hooks came up light, stripping our bait without a catch, and we had to open a small can from the reserve to fill in the gaps. We never hit the point where we had nothing to eat at all, largely because we had finally retrieved the orange sled from the shore. 3 days after the shootout, when a thick morning fog rolled in and blinded the tree line, Lowell and I had rowed over in total silence. We moved fast, watching the woods over the sights of our rifles, and dragged that plastic sled across the slush and into the boat. It was a treasure chest: freeze-dried meals, high-calorie bars, heavy winter sleeping bags, and most importantly, ammunition that fit our weapons. That haul bought us time. I still counted every can left on the shelf and every shotgun shell in the box, but the panic of starving to death had receded into the background. Water stayed steady because we kept the filtration routine tight and disciplined. Raw lake water went through layers of cloth and gravel to strip the sediment, then onto the stove until it hit a hard, rolling boil. Snow went into the big pots when it came down clean, and runoff from the roof filled the plastic tubs we kept tied to the pilings. We labeled every bottle with a black marker so we knew exactly what had been boiled and when. It wasn't a complicated system, but it was enough to keep us from getting sick with dysentery or giardia, and out here a stomach bug could kill you just as dead as a bullet. Elodie's notebook became something we treated like a tool, not just paper. She sketched the stilts in detail, marked the brace lengths we needed, and wrote down which boards flexed too much when the wind hit from the north. On calm days, she walked us around the deck, tapped spots with her knuckles like a doctor checking bones, and told us which joints to watch first. We listened to every word because we knew the lake only helped us if the legs stayed solid in the mud. Lowell settled into the role of the quartermaster, the keeper of things that could fail. He checked knots, retied frayed ropes, and always put the tools back in the exact same place so we could find them in the dark. When something cracked, he set it on the table, stared at it for a while, and then fixed it with scrap wood and galvanized metal. Now and then he and Elodie disagreed about which cross-brace mattered most, debating physics versus materials. But any sign of a growl from Rook or a sudden shift in the wind ended those talks fast. The three of us stopped feeling like strangers stuck on the same boards and started feeling like a crew running a ship. We kept a running list on a piece of cardboard nailed near the stove, a short column of urgent tasks that needed doing as soon as we had time, and a second column of things that could wait until the next calm day. Check the perimeter nails, patch the windward tarp, coil the lines, sort the scavenged shells by caliber. Every time we crossed something off that list with a heavy stroke of charcoal, we found something else to add, and that was how the days passed without us drifting into the kind of toxic boredom that makes people sloppy and gets them killed. News from the rest of the world never came. The radios stayed full of static, offering nothing but white noise and the occasional ghost of a signal that never resolved into words. The sky stayed empty except for heavy gray clouds and the occasional bird that still trusted the lake enough to land. At first, I kept expecting to see a helicopter sweeping the grid or a distant convoy moving on some road beyond the trees. By the end of the month, I stopped waiting for the cavalry and started planning as if no one else was coming, or at least no one who meant us well. For now, though, everything came back to the same few hard facts. The dead were faster than we would ever be on open ground. They were tireless predators that didn't feel pain, but they were tied to the dirt. They refused to leave it. The lake broke that hold. As long as we stayed above the water and kept the house from tearing itself apart in the wind, we had a narrow, fragile slice of safety in a world that had run out of it. The ice was still our biggest threat. If the lake froze solid enough to walk on, our moat would become a highway. But for now, the deep water held enough heat to keep the surface liquid. On the last night of that first month, I stood alone on the front deck with my hands resting on the icy rail. The snow had stopped for once, and the sky sat low, clear and full of cold stars over the frozen edges of the lake. Across the water, the tree line was a dark, impenetrable wall with no lights and no movement. The bank where I had first seen the dead sprint and where I had watched other people dive for a plastic sled looked almost clean under its new coat of white. Inside the cabin, life was continuing. I could hear the murmur of voices as Lowell shuffled the deck of cards on the table and the scratch of Elodie's pencil as she checked her list and added small marks next to tomorrow's work. Rook was sleeping near the stove, his paws twitching like he was chasing something slow and catchable in his dreams. The house creaked in the breeze, the fire popped now and then, and the stilts held firm under all of it. I thought about the apartment I had left with the door unlocked, the stopped traffic on the overpass, the first time I saw one of the pale bodies run down a car, and the moment on this same lake when I chose to take a boat into range of their reach for a man and his dog I didn't know. Every single choice, good and bad, had led to this set of boards over this stretch of black water with these two people sharing the same thin walls. We were not safe. Not in the way that word used to mean before the world turned sideways. But we were still alive, we were fed, and we understood the rules of the ground and the lake better than we had 30 days ago. That was enough for now. I turned back toward the door, listened one more time for anything on the shore that did not belong to the wind, and went inside to plan the next day on the stilts. 30 days earlier, I would have called that a joke of a plan, but now it was all we had. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.